Hi, and welcome to another Behind the Poem story from my new collection, Coffee and Paper Cuts, which was released May 22nd. I wanted to talk to you today about a poem called When, but in order to kind of explain the poem, I need to tell you a little bit more about my writing process. I almost always have a notebook with me or something to write random ideas on, whether it's my phone with a text to myself or an email to myself, an actual physical notebook, kind of like this one here, where I take down random ideas that occur to me. Now, it could be anything from a title to a concept to an idea, an emotion, something that just kind of catches my attention. For me, poetry is about observing and reflecting. Things that you hear, things that you see, things that come to you in a kind of tactile sense, smells, sounds, something that strikes you as odd, a random word, a random song, something that leads to something else, that leads to something else. And those things kind of catch my attention because inspiration and expression is kind of all around us in terms of me. I work from images all the time. I work from random abstract nouns. Some of the other videos that you'll find on my YouTube and Facebook page will tell you about how I generate ideas or about how I use writing prompts. Those kind of things happen all the time. So when I write down a title or an idea, I also have a weekly writing night at the pub, which you see in my virtual background. It's called Birdies and it's in Wimbledon. And I have a regular writing night where they play live music and I enjoy the atmosphere and open up my notebook and check which ideas strike me for filling out that particular evening. So I collect them over time and I use whatever happens to inspire me or strike me as useful that particular moment. Now, the reason why I'm explaining all of this is because usually once I have used an idea, once I have created an idea from a poem concept or a title from my list, I highlight it, underline it, strike it out, remove it from the list for some reason, like in some way. But unfortunately, well, I mean, I guess in this case, fortunately, the poem When sort of escaped that a couple of years ago. And anybody who's lived in the UK has known that there have been hot summers or hotter summers than usual the last couple of years. And there was something about the time between when it was so hot, I felt like I was back home in the States in the South, on a Florida holiday that I used to do with my family as kids, and the rain arriving as normal British summer. That moment between the sweltering heat and the rain caught me one evening, and I kind of threw down the line when the heat finally broke. When the heat finally broke, or when the rains came. There was something about that moment that caught my attention. I wrote it down as an idea in my notebook, like I always do. And then at some point during my writing night or any other time, I started typing or writing by hand, which is how I usually start, a poem that filled out that idea. What's ironic is the poem that is in the book is actually a combination of two poems, because I completed a version of it, the filled out poem from the idea, in my notebook by hand. And then something must have prevented me or stopped me from crossing it out or highlighting it or expressing or showing myself that I'd already used the idea, because at some later date, I must have forgotten that I'd already worked on that particular idea and I wrote something else. When I noticed this, when I was putting the collection together and pulling things from my kind of basic file, which has the individual poems, I noticed that two poems were made from the same idea. And I thought, okay, well, I need to decide which one I like more, and that'll be the one that I put in the book. This has happened to me only once before, and I know why it happened before. In my first book, Between Hindsight and Foresight, I had two poems that had the same title, and were both connected to similar ideas, but one was written when I was a teenager and one was written when I was an adult. And in that instance, I decided to include them both. They were called How Much. Now, there is more about those two poems in my Behind the Poem stories for Between Hindsight and Foresight. And in this case, I also decided in the end to include both poems, because whilst they were not based on the exact same idea, they both sprang from the same inspiration, that moment between the sweltering heat and the break of rain. But while one was more weather focused, or the concept of time and the moments between a dry spell and inspiration expressed kind of in the environment I was in the bar, the second one was more about taking that external stimulus, that pathetic fallacy of heat followed by rain and the breaking thereof, was more of a reflection of the internal, what happens when you're so angry and then you finally let go of that angry and feel the loss. When you're hurt or you're upset or you're sad and it's kind of tense and cloying and horrible, like a heat wave, like it's boiling, and then the heat of that finally breaks and you actually don't know, you start to cry and you don't know when you're going to be able to stop. And so the two ideas were linked by their inspirational source. That first initial line that occurred to me on a random day during the summer, which was when it went from really, really super hot to rain. And I just couldn't get rid of both. I couldn't not include either. And so I kind of reworked them so that they both could fit together and express the idea when these things happen, when the change occurs, when that moment goes between when the heat finally breaks and the rains come. So I hope you enjoy the poem, understanding that it is a union of two poems based on one idea of that moment. Thank you for listening to another Behind the Poem story. I hope that you enjoy all the poems in Coffee and Paper Cuts. It's available in paperback, on Kindle, and in audiobook form. So access it however you want, but I hope that you'll return again for another story behind the poem. Thank you.